Welcome to Chapter 9, International Law. The world is one economy, with every country linked in countless financial ways to almost every other. Business today often involves international commerce, a trend that will only increase. By 2010, a dozen developing countries with a total population 10 times that of the United States will account for 40% of all export opportunities. Business people cannot afford to ignore requirements and principles of international law. G.K. Chesterton said, "What affects men sharply about a foreign nation is not so much finding or not finding familiar things. It is rather not finding them in the familiar place." Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "The greatest meliorator of the world is selfish, huckstering trade." In 1992, the United States exported $448 billion worth of goods and services. By 1997, just 5 years later, that figure swelled to over $930 billion. That's a 110% increase in 5 years. Now the United States exports more than $800 billion worth of goods and an additional $330 billion worth of services. Each of the top 10 multinational enterprises earns greater annual revenue than the gross national product of 2/3 of the world's nations. Over 200 multinational enterprises have annual sales exceeding $1 billion. Many multinational enterprises have more available cash than the majority of nations. The power represented in this cash means that international regulations are vital. The Export Administration Act of 1985 balances the need for free trade with important requirements of national security. It also allows the federal government to restrict exports if they endanger national security, harm foreign policy goals, or drain scarce resources. The Controlled Commodities List, made by the Secretary of Commerce, lists restricted items which may not be exported without a license. The Arms Export Control Act permits the President to make a second list of controlled items, all related to military weaponry. Tariffs are a duty or tax imposed on goods entering a country. Tariffs are calculated based on classification and valuation of the items being imported. Dumping is selling goods in a foreign market for less than normal price to drive out local competition. The U.S. Department of Commerce will impose a dumping duty when they suspect that the low prices are intended to harm American companies. Subsidized goods are those for which the home government has given a benefit, such as low taxes. Subsidized goods are charged a countervailing duty to equalize the prices. A quota is a limit placed on the quantity of a particular good that may enter a nation. Quotas may grow a certain percentage per year, or they may stay the same. An import ban means that certain goods are flatly prohibited. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade created the World Trade Organization to stimulate international commerce and resolve trade disputes. GATT is an international treaty which dates back to the 1940s, with its most recent version signed by 126 nations in 1994. In the 1940s, tariffs on industrial goods averaged about 40%. This figure is now closer to 4%. The latest round of cuts should drop tariffs to about 3.7% and create more categories of duty-free goods. Even with the perceived benefits, opponents claim that the United States will not be able to compete with countries that have underpaid workers. The World Trade Organization is an international court created by the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs to stimulate international commerce and to hear complaints about violations. A panel of judges review the WTO decisions and recommend withdrawal from the WTO if excess unfounded decisions are made. Here are some issues raised by and addressed by GATT. GATT opponents fear environmental problems due to uncontrolled growth in developing nations. Also, child labor is not adequately limited by GATT. Another issue GATT deals with is increasing protection for intellectual property. The European Union, or the EU, is comprised of 25 countries in Europe. It sets standards for tariffs, dumping, subsidies, antitrust, and transportation. Most of the members have adopted a common currency called the euro. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, is comprised of Mexico, Canada, and the United States. This agreement eliminates almost all trade barriers between the three member nations. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations is comprised of 10 Asian countries and seeks to eliminate tariffs, accelerate economic growth, and promote peace and stability in the region. Mercosur is comprised of 4 South American countries. It eliminated almost all trade barriers between the nations and established a broad social agenda focusing on education, labor, culture, the environment, justice, and consumer protection. Before a domestic manufacturer can begin engaging in direct sales in a foreign country, they must decide which of 3 potentially conflicting laws will govern the transaction. The United Nations Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods, the CISG, governs contracts between 2 parties from 2 signatory countries unless they specifically opt out. It must also be decided where disputes will be settled and in what language and currency the transactions will take place. Parties may also require a letter of credit, which is a bank's guarantee of payment. A company can also decide to engage in indirect sales through a distributor in a foreign country. The choice of law, legal forum, language, and currency are the same as with direct sales. The company must also determine if the distributor will be an exclusive dealer, meaning that they will not carry any competing lines of goods. The company may have to agree to let the foreign country be the exclusive distributorship and not let any competing distributors sell your goods. The company must also be careful not to violate antitrust laws. The European antitrust law from the Treaty of Rome outlaws any agreement, contract, or discussion that distorts competition within EU countries. The American antitrust law from the Sherman Act controls anti-competitive conduct that harms the American market. In the event of a conflict, international comity requires one court to respect the other legal system and decline to hear a suit if it would be more logical to be resolved in the other country. Licensing means giving a foreign company rights to produce your product. When a company decides to do this, they have to be certain that the country they're dealing with will honor the patents and trademarks. The repatriation of profits refers to when some countries allow profits made by foreign investors to be taken back home. Others don't allow this. Expropriation means that in some cases, private businesses can be bought for a fair price by the government without consent. Most nations respect the principle of sovereign immunity in which courts of one nation lack the jurisdiction or power to hear suits against foreign governments. In the United States, the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act states that American courts cannot hear cases against a foreign country, even in expropriation cases. There are 3 exceptions: when the country waives this protection, when the suit is over commercial activity, and when the foreign country has illegally confiscated property which has ended up in the United States. The Act of State Doctrine requires an American court to abstain from any case in which a court order would interfere with the ability of the President or Congress to conduct foreign affairs. Investment insurance is a wise business expenditure when investing abroad. In 1971, Congress established the Overseas Private Investment Corporation to insure U.S. investors against overseas losses due to political violence and expropriation. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act makes it illegal for an American business person to give anything of value to a foreign official in order to influence an official decision. In many countries, bribery is commonplace, but foreign bribery is still against the FCPA. If a country's written laws allow bribery, although few do, it is not a violation of the FCPA. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, produced a Convention of Combating Bribery of Foreign Public Officials in International Business Transactions. About 36 of the world's largest trading nations have ratified the convention. The world is one economy, with every country linked in countless financial ways to almost every other. To conduct business today is very often to engage in international commerce, and that makes it important to understand the basics of international law. You made it through Chapter 9 on International Law. Now let's get started with the essay assignment, quiz, and discussion board.